Russia says it's considering revising its nuclear doctrine. That's the guidelines governing the use of its most powerful weapons. As a leading nuclear power, how much of a risk does Russia pose to NATO, Europe, and the rest of the world? Hello and welcome to Roundtable. I'm Enda Brady. Now, as Western countries step in to arm Ukraine in its war against Russia, Moscow has been trying to restrain NATO with nuclear threats. Is Russia using its nuclear doctrine merely to keep the Western military alliance in check, or do these warnings actually have teeth?
As Ukrainian tanks rolled into Russia's Kursk region in August, they cross what was for the Kremlin a critical red line. Since Russia began its all-out war on Ukraine in 2022, Russian President Vladimir Putin and other politicians have repeatedly invoked its nuclear doctrine. This allows for the use of nuclear arms, but only as a means of deterrence. But in recent months, its ministers have said they would lower the bar for using nuclear arms.
For some reason, the West believes that Russia will never use nuclear weapons. We have a nuclear doctrine. Look what it says. If someone's actions threaten our sovereignty and territorial integrity, we consider it possible for us to use all means at our disposal.
Analysts say that Russia has been threatening NATO with a revision of its nuclear doctrine to weaken the West's support for Ukraine. They say that NATO's decision to supply Kiev with billions of dollars in arms, some of which have been used on Russian soil, has provoked Russia. Another source of tension is Ukraine's calls for its allies to supply it with long-range cruise missiles, which would enable its forces to strike deeper into Russian territory.
If Putin perceives that the United States is ignoring his threats, he may try to signal to Washington the heightened danger of its support to Ukraine by authorizing another large nuclear exercise. President Putin would probably only authorize the use of nuclear weapons if he perceived an existential threat to the Russian state or regime.
So what has Russia done about Ukraine's moves? Reuters reports that Moscow is building a launch site for its new nuclear-powered, nuclear-armed cruise missile. In June, Russia said that it would start producing short and medium-range land-based missiles again. Moscow has already transferred tactical nuclear arms to Belarus and suspended its involvement in the New START treaty that caps the number of warheads that Russia and the US can deploy. Reaction from the US has been sharp.
So it is not the first time we have seen irresponsible rhetoric from Vladimir Putin. It is no way for the leader of a nuclear-armed state to speak. That said, we do not have any sign that Russia is preparing to use a nuclear weapon, and we will continue to monitor this carefully.
In June, NATO head Jens Stoltenberg said the military alliance was discussing getting more nuclear missiles ready. The US has plans to deploy long-range conventional arms to Germany by 2026. So as both sides engage in a game of nuclear chess, are these risks for real?
Well, let's meet our guests. Joining me from Surrey in the UK is Martin Smith. He's a senior lecturer in Defence and International Affairs at the Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst. Here with me in the studio is Elisabeth Braw. She's a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Also joining us is Marko Gasic. He's an international affairs analyst. And you're all very welcome to Roundtable. Martin, to you first. Russia has had a lot of red lines on this issue. Many of them have been crossed already, and yet Vladimir Putin has not deployed any nuclear weapons. How much of this is saber-rattling rhetoric for international headlines, if you like?
I think the short and honest answer is we just don't know. But I think that is in large part what Mr. Putin and his officials are counting on, in the sense that there are a number of different views as to what basically underpins the deterrent effect of the possession of nuclear weapons. One of them holds that it's the ability to create elements of doubt and uncertainty in the minds of your opponents, that when you're dealing with even the faint possibility of nuclear weapons being used or deployed in some way, there's absolutely no margin of error. The opponent has to be 100% certain in their own mind that there's no possibility of nuclear weapons being used against them. And as long as Russia, number one, is a very capable and significant nuclear weapon state, and number two, its leaders and officials continue to hint at or make statements suggesting that there is a possibility of nuclear weapons somehow being used or introduced into the equation, there's always going to be that crucial element of uncertainty. Now, of course, it's perfectly true that so far, the various red lines, as you say, Enda, that have been set have been crossed, have been breached in significant ways, and no action in the nuclear domain has followed, which is why it might be significant that on this occasion, Russian officials have taken a slightly different approach. They haven't formally declared a particular red line in so many words, but what they have done, of course, the Deputy Foreign Minister last week has made a statement indicating that in some way Russia's nuclear or attitude to nuclear policy and nuclear strategy and the potential utility of elements of its nuclear capability is in the process of changing. So I think all of this is designed yet again to try to introduce crucial elements of doubt and uncertainty in the minds primarily, not so much of Mr. Zelensky's government, but in the minds primarily of Western leaders and decision makers in Washington and other NATO capitals.
Elisabeth, if we look at the list of issues that Russia and very senior leaders have said, any attack on Crimea, which they've occupied since 2014, Finland and Sweden joining NATO would be another red line issue, F-16 jets being given to Ukraine, all of these would bring about a nuclear response, and it still hasn't happened.
No, it still hasn't happened, but I think that is the intention, to cause this confusion on the other side about what is it, where is the threshold above which Russia will respond with nuclear weapons. And we should remember that traditionally all nuclear weapon states, official nuclear weapon states, except China, have given themselves the right to respond with nuclear weapons against a massive conventional attack by the other side. Well, massive is in the eye of the beholder, right? Or rather in the eye of the attacker and the country being attacked. So we don't really know. There's no definition of what a massive conventional attack is. But Sweden and Finland joining NATO is not a massive conventional attack. So Russia is essentially mudding the waters and causing confusion by suggesting all these different scenarios that may warrant a Russian nuclear response. And that is hugely reckless because it leaves the other side, i.e. Western countries, in this confusion about what it is, where that threshold is. And not even, it's worth remembering, not even the Soviets did that. They didn't play semantic games with nuclear weapons because they knew it was a very, it's a devastating force, a devastating weapon you have, and you don't play games with it.
Marko, just bring you in on that. I mean, Vladimir Putin is playing a very clever game here, isn't he? Because ultimately he's saying to Western allies of Ukraine that don't push me too far because this is what might happen.
Well, I think Vladimir Putin, his problem is that he's got a very clear Russian nuclear protocol. He's had it for a while. He wants to keep it. He wants transparency. But actually, I have to say, it's the other side that want to confuse the issue because they would like a situation where they could use a massive conventional attacks through their Ukrainian external appendage to bomb away happily in Russia and to attack Russia with Russia saying, oh, well, we'll never retaliate in any way beyond the conventional. So really, it's the other side that's wanting to sow the confusion in the situation. Hitherto, Russia's been very clear, but Russia's now playing catch-up. President Putin and his protocol are out of date on the substantive issue. You now have a quasi-non-NATO member, Ukraine, which is perfectly happy to internationalize this war with the support of those backing it, and they need Putin as acquiescent to that, and they need his. If he is in a state of confusion with his nuclear protocol, he can't launch. He won't know when to launch. The situation won't be clear. So the confusion is being sown by Putin's opponents. I would say, though, that it's quite interesting. We've heard so much about the mad Vlad Putin scenario. Clearly, if Western countries are so confident about allowing Ukraine to launch these attacks into Russia, allowing them to escalate these attacks, moving the goalposts, blurring the red lines. Clearly, they understand that Mr. Putin is, as you say, a rational person who doesn't actually want a nuclear war. However, if you blur those red lines, and the West is doing so, then you are creating a dangerous situation instead of a transparent one. I would also end with the fact that when we talk about no first use, Russia had the no first use policy, but its main opponent in this sad situation, the US hasn't. The US gives itself the right to first use. So let's not ask Russia to go compliant into no first use when the US is unwilling to follow the same route.
Let's just take a look at the number of nuclear warheads worldwide. This was as of January this year. There were approximately 12,100 nuclear warheads worldwide, and almost 90% of them belong to just two countries, the United States and Russia. Russia has 5,580 nuclear warheads, and the United States just marginally less, 5,044. So, Martin, lowering the threshold for use, do you think Vladimir Putin, as we look towards 2025 and the third anniversary of the Ukraine war, do you think he is lining up the possibility of using one of these warheads on a Ukrainian target?
Again, the short and simple answer, Enda, is that we just don't know. And that, I think, is a key element of Mr. Putin's strategy. Coming back to, and I think all three of us have touched on this in our responses so far, by definition, there's no escape from this. When nuclear weapons are present in the equation, and of course in the context of the overall international coalition supporting Ukraine, you've got Russia as a very capable nuclear weapon state on the one side, and you've got the United States, but also Britain and France as established nuclear weapon states on the other. This cuts both ways, and I would agree on this point with, I think, what Marko was saying, is the element of doubt and uncertainty and the impossibility of eliminating doubt and uncertainty from the equation has a mitigating impact on both sides. So we don't know whether Mr. Putin actually would, under any circumstances, resort to nuclear use. But that is what, in this kind of thinking that we're talking about here, that is precisely what doesn't necessarily prevent the crossing of specific red lines, but it does condition the overall Western response. So there are limits in the overall strategic picture that NATO members have imposed, most particularly consistent refusal to deploy Western European or American forces on the ground in Ukraine in a combat role, rebuffing Mr. Zelensky's pleas for NATO air forces to get directly involved in assisting Ukraine's existing air defense in downing Russian missile and drone strikes against targets in Ukraine. And the particular one that's being focused on at the moment, of course, is whether or not the British and American governments will give consent to the basically unlimited use of the long-range missiles that they have donated to Ukraine against targets inside Russia. So I think we need to keep in mind that where the specific red lines have been breached, that Mr. Putin has set, as you indicated earlier, Enda, there's actually quite a lot of substantial evidence that the deterrent impact of this uncertainty, this inescapable uncertainty, has helped to condition and to set important limits on the nature and scale of the Western support to Ukraine.
Elisabeth, one issue that kind of confuses me is Ukraine going into the Kursk region of Russia. Surely that would have been the point at which Vladimir Putin would have said, this is where I can deploy a nuclear tactical warhead. And he didn't.
He didn't. And I think it will be fascinating for future historians when they get access to the files from the Kremlin from this period to see how the conversations went, if those conversations are taken down, because it seems like, as you say, such an obvious case where he could have made the argument without justification, in my opinion, and in many people's opinion, but nevertheless, he could have made the argument that this is one step too far. Now we'll respond with nuclear weapons, and we'll never know why he didn't. Whether it was because they managed to surprise the Russians so massively that the Russians didn't really have a plan. That it does indeed seem to be the case. But when we talk about Ukraine, it's important to remember too that this will strengthen their case for inclusion in the Western alliances, and most especially Nato. They gave up their nuclear weapons against the promise that Russia would respect Ukraine's Ukraine's territorial
and
integrity.
Territorial
integrity. That was the promise, and it was guaranteed by Western states. And Ukraine, along with Belarus and Kazakhstan, did that voluntarily. We can say it was happier days back then in the 90s, but nevertheless, Ukraine did that, and it was promised that Russia would not violate its territorial integrity. And yet, here we are, Russia has violated its territorial integrity, and Ukraine can make the case that, look, we did this, we took one for the team, meaning the global security, and we are suffering the consequences. Because we don't have nuclear weapons. If we had nuclear weapons, Russia would never have dared to do this. So it in a sense, it strengthens Ukraine's case, not that it makes a difference at the moment.
Marko, just on that issue of the Kursk region and what Ukraine has done by going into it, do you think that was the point, could have been a tipping point for Putin in terms of looking at nuclear weapons?
Well, I think that the Russians realized that the reason why the Ukrainians went into Kursk at all was a little bit like a chess game where their own position is under serious threat, so they tackle the other wing and start creating an attack of theirs. So the Russians understood the context in which this was happening and simply continued with the offensive, which had created all the problems for Ukraine down in the Donetsk area, Pokrovsk, that area which they're surrounding. That whole salient is in danger of falling to the Russians. So they understood why it happened, and they weren't that threatened by the amount of what was going on in Kursk at that point. It would have been interesting if I should say, by the way, with these nuclear weapons, as you've made the point, that tactical nuclear weapons are a different ballgame from the major nuclear weapons that end civilizations and end huge things. These are far less long-lasting and far more limited in their scope, though obviously we want none of them anyway. The point is, it would have been quite interesting if the Russians had launched a tactical nuclear weapon in Kursk, i.e. on accepted Russian territory, how that would have affected the red lines that for example, General Petraeus said that if one was launched, all hell would break loose. But he didn't put it quite like that, but that was what he meant. If the Russians launched it on their own sovereign territory, well, I guess they'd have the right to do that. However, they didn't, because for the reasons that I've said. I would also add, though, that in terms of the history of Ukraine, I mean, Elisabeth makes a good point. However, the point is that Ukraine was accepted as independent by Russia, and all the deal was made on the basis of Ukraine being eternally neutral between these opposed power blocks, never on one side or the other. Once you become an external appendage of one of the sides, probing into the other one's security, that's an entirely different thing, which wasn't on the tin when it was signed. And that's the mistake that Ukraine made all those years ago, and that's why we're sitting here discussing this today.
Martin, let's talk consequences. What would happen if, and I know it's a huge if, Russia did use any type of nuclear weapon? What do you think the next steps would be from Ukraine and its Western allies?
Well, if we take it at face value, at least, the Biden administration has been very clear about this. And Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, has made various statements addressing this question, most recently just a few days ago. And what the United States has said is if there is any use, whether it's at the intercontinental or the so-called tactical level, if the nuclear threshold in any way, shape or form is crossed by Russia, then the United States would, quote unquote, destroy Russia's military capability in Ukraine. So what the US is basically doing there, I think, is twofold. It is making obviously an explicit threat, a deterrent threat. But I think on the other side of the coin, it's reminding Mr. Putin of the extent to which so far the American and the Western response has indeed been restrained, because the United States militarily quite clearly could intervene and could intervene significantly. And the Russian army has been, as we know, significantly degraded and debilitated already in Ukraine. And so I don't think we should regard Mr. Sullivan's statement as being an incredible threat. I think under the circumstances, if the United States chose to seek to do so, it could at the very least do serious damage to Russia's military in Ukraine. And because over 90% of Russia's overall, certainly land force capability is currently committed to the war in Ukraine, what that means is the United States could seriously degrade Russia's conventional military capability overall. So again, would that actually happen? Would the United States actually go ahead and do that? We just don't know. But I think the clear message that is being conveyed there is any kind of nuclear threshold, crossing of the nuclear threshold, would violate a taboo, and the consequences would be, number one, extremely serious, and number two, extremely damaging and debilitating for the key component which underpins Russia's power, which is its military, its existing conventional, usable power, its existing conventional military capability.
Elisabeth, same question to you. What do you think the consequences would be if we did see Russia start using tactical nuclear warheads?
It would put the West in a terrible bind. We should really remember how far we have come from the worst days of the Cold War, where there really was a situation of mutually assured destruction. It's still mutually assured destruction, but somewhat less of a destruction of the world. And all of that happened through painstakingly negotiated agreements between the United States and the Soviet Union in particular, but other countries as well. And to the point where in the 90s, we were able to discuss a significant reduction of not just of arsenals, but of nuclear weapons in Europe. And there was even, I remember writing this in my master's thesis way back, there was even the prospect of a nuclear weapons-free Europe. And it was realistic in the late 90s. And today, now we are talking about an equally realistic threat of tactical nuclear weapons being used. And I think one of the problems is that we don't have regular communications between the leaders of both sides, meaning Biden and Putin. I'm not trying to glorify the Cold War, but there was a red phone, and there was this back channel that served as a guarantee that there wouldn't be an accidental nuclear war. There would at least be a conversation between the leaders of the United States and the Soviet Union before anything happened. Today, the contact between Biden and Putin is virtually non-existent, and that it's. We can debate whether or not that's good, but or whether it would be useful to have conversations. But in a nuclear context, you need to have that line open so that you can at least eliminate the risk of an accidental nuclear conflict, and you would at least have some sort of early warning that Russia was about to launch a nuclear weapon against Ukraine.
Marko, that's a very good point Elisabeth makes, isn't it? That not that long ago, this conversation would have been fantasy, complete science fiction, unthinkable.
Yes, certainly the red lines have moved quite a lot. I mean, I agree with Elisabeth that the times of the Cold War settlements, I mean, nobody liked the Soviet Union very much, but there were two big powers. They knew that they could destroy each other and the rest, and they took steps to make sure institutionally that didn't happen. They signed their agreements, they stuck broadly to those agreements, and the world was pretty safe. When one of those parties left the table or said, okay, no mas, no more, we give in, expecting that they would be invited to the table as partners or anything, then we saw the other situation, which unfortunately absolute power corrupts absolutely, and the winning party, if I may term them that way, or the successful party, then proceeded to arrange things according to its own design worldwide. And that included, unfortunately, the area we're discussing today. So we are in a situation we are where there are no telephones. Perhaps there are some dark grey ones, some back channels between military and security chiefs. There may be those. But in general terms, that the dialogue has gone, and there's a sense in which the partnership, even till quite late, the Russians were talking about our Western partners, but that's all off the table now because the Russians perceive themselves as being the target of their Western partners, their resources being coveted by their Western partners, and their population, which probably wasn't too keen, as someone said, on this war at the start, though it had its justification, nevertheless will be quite keen on the war being prosecuted until at least Russia is safe. So everyone wants a bit of safety, but the Russians are no exception.
Martin, final point to you. I mean, we find ourselves in a very, very dangerous time now as we head towards 2025 in Europe. All of this talk about nuclear weapons, I mean, it's dangerous, isn't it? I mean, it's much more than just saber rattling at this stage.
It's potentially dangerous, and it's potentially dangerous if either or both sides refuse to accept what I consider to be the reality of the situation in Ukraine currently, which is a situation of stalemate. Neither side is in a position where it can decisively win militarily through conventional force on the ground.
Martin, Elisabeth and Marko, thank you all so much for your insight. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Just search for Roundtable TRT World. And if you like what you see there, please do hit that subscribe button. But for now, from me, Enda Brady, and all of the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.